Welcome to the story of Daniel, Episode 1, The Beginning. I was born November 20th, 1957, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Houston, Texas. My first year of life I spent on Foster Street in Houston, while my parents had our family's new home built. In November 1958, my family moved to 5757 Thrush Street, and an area referred to as Beldart, right off of South Park Boulevard. I grew up and attended Madding Elementary, where I made good friends. Desiree Cayley and Walt Laverne are, to name just a couple. My family attended South Park Baptist Church, where I was baptized, and my father, Kenneth Edward Hanning, served as an usher and sometimes deacon. Very early, even before we moved to Pearland, I was a Cub Scout. My mother, Margaret Nora Hanning, served as den mother for my Cub Scout pack, and Dad served as the troop's treasurer. I remember going to blue and gold banquets held in the cafeteria of Madding Elementary, and it was the same room that I graduated from Cub Scouts to Webelos. I remember the night that I turned my Cub Scout cap and scarf in and received my Webelo patch and scarf. The Cub Scouts taught me the importance of self-reliance, respect of elders in the community, and that knowledge is power. At the same time I was learning these lessons in Scouts, I was learning even more in my father's garage. My father was an X-ray technician for 3 orthopedic surgeons in the Herman Professional Building in Houston. They were the Herman Associates. Doctors Hutcherson, Dr. Moore, and Dr. Baker. When my father came home from work, he had dinner with the family, only to go out to work in the garage. My father ran a small business out of our garage, K&M Electronics, Ken and Margie. My father repaired televisions, radios, record players, ham radios, and transmitters, teletype machines, and, well, pretty much everything if he could get the schematics. When work was done, he spent time on his ham radio. This garage is where I learned electronics and satisfied my curiosity for how things worked. It was also how our family could afford summer vacations every year. It forced me to see how large the world was outside our little corner. My father taught me that a hobby could help create financial stability for a family, that a father's work was never done, and that self-reliance was not a burden, it was an honor. I helped my father every night in that garage. Once my homework was done and all my chores were done, I would ask my mother, "Can I go outside and help Dad?" "Yes," she would respond, "but try not to get in the way. Be careful." Even at a young age, it seems, I had a bit of a problem being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I would go out. If Dad was working on some electronics, I would hold a light for him or hold the solder as he replaced parts in a broken radio or television. I was an unusually curious boy. My father used to say a lot, "Look with your eyes, not your fingers," and "There are no eyeballs in the tips of your fingers." Reason being, seemingly on a regular basis, I got shocked or electrocuted. It was not the fault of my father. It was just the sharp end of my curiosity getting the better of me. But I learned. I learned the basics of electronics. I learned how to use tools. I learned about the larger world outside our garage, our city, our state, our nation. I learned at 6 and 7 where China was, and the USSR, and India, and Japan. I heard the voices of people from these faraway lands as they crackled over the speaker from my father's ham radio receiver. I remember helping my father erect his first 50-foot aluminum tower in the backyard on Thrush Street, and watched as he and his friends lifted his first dipole antenna on top of that tower. Late at night, I would sit by the window in my room and look up at the red blinking light on top of the tower and think about the faraway lands and the people that lived in those lands. Coming next, Episode 2, The Formative Years and the Hannings Moved to Pearland. Thanks for watching. Hi there. Now, the story of Daniel. Episode 2, Formative Years and the Hannings Moved to Pearland. The holidays for the Hanning family were an enjoyable but busy time. Starting in October, when the air became crisp and temperatures dropped, my father would add a new duty to his agenda. He took on the creation and display of festive and seasonal outdoor decorations. Though my father never talked openly of it, he loved the holiday season. Oh no, not the shopping and not the cooking. That was Mom's job. He just loved the decorating of the house for the neighbors. It almost seemed as though he regarded it as some social responsibility to provide eye candy for the community and his neighbors. I never sensed he thought of it as an obligation or a competition. No, it was his way of expressing himself. My father didn't sing or dance or anything of that nature. Oh, yes, he sang hymns at the First South Park Baptist Church, but you would never see him bursting into song around the house or the neighborhood. Now, having said, you might think that, like most Americans, Christmas decorations would be his strong suit, his favorite outlet, his forte. Nope, not my father. My father got a gas out of Halloween decorations. It started back on Thrush Street. And I'm not just talking about some paper decorations in the windows or on the front doors. Oh no, that would not do for Ken Hanning. Like his activities in the garage, anything must be done down to the umpteenth detail, and with precision and exacting quality. And, like in the garage also, there was Danny, and he was totally committed to doing everything he could to help make his father's desires manifest in our home. I generally would give Dad little creative ideas. For our last year on Thrush Street, I said to Dad, how about a witch on a broom? And then, as he was processing that idea, I followed up with, and Dad, what if we could make it talk? Well, that's all it would take. The first year I have a clear memory of doing the witch, we went all out. First, I need to explain a little something that is kind of embarrassing. August 25th, 1987. I was involved in an accident at my work. This is where I believe all my problems with my neck and my spine really got their genesis. I was working in an electronics storeroom at Target on PCH in Manhattan Beach. I was doing a visual inventory of a very high stack of stock, literally minding my own business. This stack of stock was not on steel racks like everything else in the storeroom. It was between two shelving units and just kind of stacked one on top of each other all the way up. It was kind of like that game Jenga, stacked up. Well, that day, even though nobody pulled anything out, down from its perch at the very top of a 15 to 20 foot pile of stock was a Smith Corona typewriter, still in its shipping crate. For no apparent reason, that Smith Corona typewriter came tumbling down on an unsuspecting Daniel. The typewriter fell and struck me at the base of my skull, the cervical spine. The impact caused multiple spinal cord contusions, closed head trauma, loss of feeling, and loss of the use of an arm and a leg. I was hospitalized for 3 months at Centinela Hospital in Los Angeles. From there, I was moved to an adult rehabilitation center for head-injured adults where I spent 4 months. Since that accident, I've had difficulty remembering. Some of my past friends and even had the loss of friends at the time. I have worked hard to rebuild my memory, but there are still holes in my memory. So please understand. Thank you. And now back to the story. Yes, my father replied. That year he and I built a witch sitting in an aluminum deck chair. Oh, she was scary, with a big black pointed hat, black robes, and a really good witch mask with a floodlight pointed right at her, and it was controlled from the inside so we could switch it off and on. Hidden inside of the witch was a speaker, and it was connected to an old intercom system that my father had salvaged from one of the companies he did electronic work for. We ran wires that were well hidden from the back of the witch into a window and into my parents' bedroom. My father would stand at the front door and watch for children to come up the walk. Then he would signal me using a small microphone which he held standing at the front door. When they were in visual range of the witch, I would screech into the intercom, and my screech, then a high-pitched voice, would come out of the witch. Oh, we made so many children scream, and many ran away without getting their candy. And as with all great things and accomplishments, there were detractors. I can't tell you just how many parents came back with their children to bark at my father about scaring their children half to death. And here we thought that was the point of Halloween. I mean, the children all got their candy. And we generally gave out the nice name brand stuff. I mean, name brand candies like M&M's and the Reese's Peanut Butter Cups and the like. But each and every year, my father and I would build a witch and make her talk and scare the bejesus out of the neighborhood children. Thanksgiving, my father would take a break from decorating outside. That is, until the week of Thanksgiving. The Monday of that week, my father and I would climb up into the attic and haul down all the Christmas decorations. The lights, the garlands, the tree trimmings, the stand, and this really neat color wheel that we had. I don't know, you might have had one too. It had the 4 colors on it, and it rotated around the front of the floodlight, and it would make your tree green or blue or red. Really neat. We would sort out the decorations, untangle all the strings of lights, so that every Friday after the Thanksgiving Thursday, we would get on ladders and hang lights on the eaves and around the doors in the garage. We would put the tree in the front room of the house, right inside the bay window. I think I gained a feeling that in order to be a good neighbor, you must contribute to the holiday season in your community. It was not just enough to decorate for the family. Being a good member of the community meant you went that extra step. You got creative and tried each year to do something different and bring life to the holidays. Now that I think about it, I think my father and his standard for entertaining the community at the holidays just might be where I started getting my sense of showmanship. In school, I was a different boy. I didn't like standing out. I didn't like drawing attention to myself. While in Houston, I didn't do too well in school. I mean, I generally passed and held my own, but nothing noteworthy until I found choir. I remember being in choir in elementary school at Madding Elementary. And again, I didn't stand out, but I was part of entertaining the community. I felt that through choir, I was giving back to the school and the community and being a part of something much larger than myself in the process. Then, suddenly, the Hanning family was out on the weekends, looking for a new home. Oh, I understood why. I'd listen to my parents talk, and I'd watch the TV as they broadcast riots at the school my older brother Daryl was attending. It scared me a lot. I loved my brother Daryl. I still do. But back then, well, Daryl taught me how to tie my shoes, how to play checkers. After that, how to play chess. We shared the same room until we moved to Pearland, and well, to me, Daryl hung the moon. Here is where I have a little more than just a small hole in my memory. I don't remember the family moving. I don't remember when we first got there. And I have only vague memories of elementary school. I remember being sick a lot when we first got there. I remember the smell of cloves in the old elementary choir room. And one other thing, I remember feeling distinctly safer in Pearland. I remember my grades improved. The next block of memories I have was starting at the new middle school. And that, my kind readers and listeners, is where we will take this story up on Friday. Well, yesterday. Thank you for reading. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting my cause. Thank you for caring. And as always, may God bless.
Right.
And now, Episode 3, The Hannings and Life on Francis Street. As I have told you, much of elementary school at Pearland is just gone, dust in the wind, for whatever reason. Though, my memories of the time I spent in the then new middle school are pretty clear, and there seem to be a good many of them. Now, I really do wish that my parents had purchased those yearbooks. I was never really big on buying them as a boy. Now, that may have been merely because my mother and father both never really liked or showed interest in buying them, or I was just following their lead because our family was on a strict budget and so frugal that that was seen as a frivolous expenditure. Whatever the reason, I am working without a net here. If I get some dates wrong or some places wrong, please be kind. One of my very first memories of middle school and the new building was the smell. It didn't have the same smells as the high school, middle school campus. Those buildings had been there for some time and had very distinct smells. The lockers were the old wooden ones without locks. Boy, that's a statement. And shiny brass handles. I liked the old lockers. The new building, when you could smell something, smelled of fresh construction materials. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was very happy that we had a new building. The chairs were new, the blackboards were new, the lockers were new, and it was the newest building I'd ever seen since I'd arrived at Pearland besides my own home. One of the biggest downsides was that it was dark. There was hardly any natural light in the whole building. This took me off guard and kind of gave the school a prison shining, if you'll pardon me. Everything, everywhere, had this greenish tinge. Where this struck me most was in the cafeteria gym. I distinctly remember going into the cafeteria for lunch the very first time. Standing in the line to get food, well, it all looked so unnatural. None of the foods looked the right colors. People's faces looked ghoulish and without natural tones and hues. It took me quite some time before I could eat in that cafeteria. The first day, I picked at the food and tossed most of my lunch. The problem was the lights, especially in the cafeteria. They had these huge gas lights in the ceiling, and I'm not sure what they were. I mean, like argon, xenon, neon. I don't know what gas or element they used, but it gave off the single most unnatural light I had ever seen. Now that I'm thinking about this, did anyone else notice these lighting? I mean, Then again, I still hadn't at this time found a clique to be a part of in Pearland. I had been in Pearland for about a year and just hadn't bonded with much of anybody. Now, don't get me wrong, it was me. I was a major reason, I'm sure, that I hadn't found a group, like, goths, jocks, nerds, dweebs. A group to fit in, to hang with. The good news was that I really liked books. As I remember, it seemed like everything was new. All the textbooks and the books in the library and the books in the classrooms all looked to be new and never used. I really enjoy books. I always have. I enjoy reading. So that was welcomed and enjoyable. The floors were brand new and shiny, and they lent themselves for sock skating. And I indulged my thirst for all things comic and funny by regularly kicking off my shoes and skating to my heart's desire. The lockers worked well and didn't smell like the last person's gym socks. That was a good thing. The classes were all inside. I remember the last year at the old middle school, they had these temporary buildings, these like double wide trailers. Ugh, I disliked those classrooms for many reasons. Now, what was totally incredible, absolutely phenomenal, and wonderful? The teachers. That's what. There seemed to be an energy level, an excitement among them that I hadn't seen before. I enjoy learning, and I have ever since I was young. The only classes that ever frustrated me or really challenged me, spelling. Sorry, but just way too much rote and no rhyme or reason. Math, totally nailed it, often helping my friends in class. Just dug math. Science, without a doubt, one of my favorite classes, and I always made A's or B's. History was then, as it is now, a subject that I could easily devote the rest of my life to in the pursuit of and be the happiest little Danny the world has ever seen. Except, of course, I would want to act. I joined choir in the 3rd grade at Matting. I can't sing alone worth diddly, but put me in a choir and it was like a duck to water. I sang in every choir, every year, from that year forward until I graduated. It is what got me through the nearly daily beatings in gym class. From the time I got to middle school until I got on stage my sophomore year, I was pretty much bullied. It happened, I lived. But my point is, choir made the pain go away. Anyone else remember? Okay, here's something. Does anyone else remember the woman that was the choir teacher in the brand new school? She was only there 1 year. It was like our 8th grade. First year in the new building. She sang with the Houston Grand Opera and took her class to see Madame Butterfly, which she performed in, by the way. She was completely eccentric and larger than life, and I thoroughly enjoyed the year I had her, and I was her student. At the end of the year, some of us in the choir gave a performance of, see if you remember this, If I Were a Rich Man. It was at night, and parents were there, as well as other children. And it was in that darn ghoulish cafeteria, but the lights were out, and it was dark, but it looked normal. Right then and there, on that makeshift stage, in front of many parents and children in Pearland, I took my choir experience and added something. This something would occupy the next 4 years of my life and education, and have some effect or other on the entire rest of my life. She, the choir teacher, had cobbled together a rather convincing costume. A fake beard, a prayer shawl, a yarmulke, my budding baritone voice, and a pair made of brass, and something happened. That, my dear viewers, was the single most fun I'd had in my life to that point, and I never wanted it to end. During the period of time the Hannings arrived in Pearland and the last days of middle school, the Hanning rituals continued like clockwork. However, in the garage, things changed. The world outside was changing in big ways. The last few years the Hannings were in Houston, my eldest brother was taken from us and sent to Vietnam. Those were difficult times for the Hanning family. The whole time he was there and we were in Houston, the whole family would sit down and record letters, small reel audio tapes, and we'd send them to Ken. We would all take turns talking to him, and then Dad would mail it, and we would wait to hear back from Ken. Sure enough, 3-4 weeks later, there in the mail would be our reply tape. We would all gather back at the table and sit and listen to Ken talk and tell us of how things were going in Vietnam, what he saw, what he was doing. I loved hearing his voice. I was like 7 or 8 when he left for Vietnam. I wasn't anywhere old enough to be ready to have anyone taken from the family. And Ken was the cool one. Then, starting in Pearland, we didn't need tapes anymore. My father had invested a great deal of time, and my time, nights and weekends, and money totally upgrading his ham radio antenna and transmitter. Well, I could go on and on about this project, and I really could. It was incredible, but I won't. Suffice to say that when my father was through, we could clearly transmit and receive ham radio, single sideband, and shortwave to Vietnam. My father and I now spent hours and hours in the garage working on connecting parents here in America with their sons in Vietnam. They were called phone patches, or a phone patch. And we worked most every night connecting members of families with their children. It wasn't part of the electronic repair business, and we didn't do it for the money, though the upgrades, the money for the upgrades did come from the electronics. And my dad, he never asked for money from the people. So I worked with my dad, and I sat beside him every night while he did something pretty darn incredible. Out of his garage. Nobody ever knew. And yet it touched so many lives across the nation. I won't lie, my life was not a Norman Rockwell print, by any stretch of the imagination. Quite honestly, the time that Dad spent in the garage, and no doubt the financial investment, put a strain on my parents' relationship. I know now that some holidays things might have been tight, but only because my father had spent more money on the antenna or the transmitter than they budgeted for. I didn't know that at the time. I mean, I was part of the investment. I was out there helping him connect. The next adventure I had with my father was this space race. Remember that? It captured both our imaginations. And before the moon landing was over, many a night's sleep was lost. Many a roll of film had been developed, and many a bedtime had been missed. But like with the phone patches and electronic repairs before this, the adventures always outweighed the risk. Thank you for reading, if you're reading this. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for all your kindness and support. You know we're still continuing the campaign, and any contributions are greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, and may God bless. Hi there, this is Daniel, and this is episode 4, The Hannings and the Early 70s. Before we leap into the early 70s, I would like to go back some time to highlight some important events. 1 month and 2 weeks before I was born, Sputnik was launched by the now extinct USSR, and our world was thrust into the space race. As were we all thrust into a new age of mankind. Our generation shares that common lineage, and the space race was a series of events that bonded my father and me. From the Mercury Redstone project through the Gemini projects, my father and I watched and talked about the advent of manned space flight. The culmination of that national pride and father-son bonding experience was the Apollo project. President Kennedy had given this country an aspiration, a goal to reach together as a nation. It was 1970, and America was poised to meet that goal. When my father wasn't around, I would build models of spacecraft. I remember a gas station that we frequented that gave away paper models, the old slot A and a tab B, of the command module, the lunar lander, and even a small version of the Saturn V launch vehicle. I just had to collect them all. And I did just that and hung them from the ceiling of my bedroom. I built plastic models of the command module and the Saturn V 1B. I tried to build one of the lunar module, the lunar excursion module, but it was a real departure from a design point of view than anything I had ever built, and it just never looked quite right. I think a lot of guys made those models. I know I saw them in a lot of friends' rooms. But I felt that my father and I shared a special bond with and to the space program. At that point, my father had shared the basics of electronics with me and the basics of 20th century communications. I had learned about capacitance and resistance, how to read electronic schematics from the symbols, from what the symbols mean to how to trace a circuit shown on a schematic and the actual chassis of a device. As well, I learned how to use and read a Vohm meter, a voltage ohm meter, and how to use it to find a break in a circuit. I also learned Morse code. Yes, the dots and dashes that make up the nonverbal communication of telephony prior to Alexander Graham Bell's creation, the telephone. As I mentioned earlier, I assisted my father in running phone patches, connecting concerned parents with their children in Vietnam. The space race was like a teaching example of everything he had taught me and we had done in the garage to that point. Every single day, electronics and long-wave communications were in the news, and Americans were being introduced to the discoveries America had made reaching for the goal President Kennedy gave the nation. For my father and me, these were the best times of our lives. The whole world was using terms and gaining knowledge that we already knew. In social settings, we both had socially relevant knowledge. We understood why it took so long for a signal to come back from the Apollo spacecraft, and got to explain the line of sight when it came to satellite communications. Why the astronauts were taking a laser into space, which had a good many people concerned they were pointing it at Earth. When I would work in the garage with my father during this part of the space race, it was all we talked about. We would talk for hours, and we would share what we had individually read, and my father would always explain the electronics or technical aspects of the flight. We tried to be together for every launch and every landing. This love affair with technology and the space race came to a head July 20th, 1969. That was the day the Eagle landed on the surface of our moon. I remember sitting in front of the television beside my father. He had his single lens reflex camera pointed at the television. My father wanted to record this moment for posterity, for future Hannings to look at and remember the very important time for Ken Hanning. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the surface of the moon, my father and I cheered so loud. At that moment, we both felt a national pride. Right then, that moment, America was the superpower on the planet Earth. And what was the greatest part? Nobody had to die to make our nation great that day. No one political party accomplished this goal alone. All of America stood together, side by side, and believed in this project. America believed in President Kennedy's dream, believed in the greatness America could obtain if we just worked together towards a common goal. Well, I don't think I would have traded in, don't think I've traded in my bifocals for rose-colored glasses. Our country was in a bitterly contested war in Vietnam, and all of us had a family member in that war. Our nation was deep in a cultural war as well, and racial divisions were tearing our nation apart. But when Neil Armstrong stood on the surface of the moon, at least for that one moment, our nation was one. Not in grieving as we had been 6 years before with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, or just 1 year before in June with the assassination of his brother Robert. This time our nation stood together in the glow of national achievement. I think it was a defining moment for two generations, our fathers and mothers, and ours. I have no doubt that everyone that is watching this right now, which I knew or knew me in school, remember where they were that moment. When John F. Kennedy was shot, when Neil Armstrong stepped on the surface of the moon, it was one of the few times when not in church I saw my father with tears in his eyes. For most, it wasn't that we had beaten the Russians to the moon. I mean, some of us, we knew that Russia would never set foot on the lunar surface. It's been 60 years, and no Russian still has set foot on the moon. America is the only nation to put a man on the surface of the moon. My father and I often talked that day. We carried it with us for all his days here on Earth. One of the last times I spoke to him, I mentioned that day, and I swear he got some color back and sat up so he could talk to me about that shared event. The space race continued, and Dad and I watched and followed. From this point on, though, we felt we were part of a dying breed. Social and public interest waned, and it seemed that Congress was completely wrong-headed about NASA and the manned space program. Kind of like today. I mean, not to get off the subject or anything, but many Americans were up in arms about mankind killing the planet even then. Now, if that's true, if it's true we're killing the planet and it's going to die, how would some of us get off the planet to continue mankind? Just a thought. So America is losing interest in the space program. We landed on the moon, and for some, everything is kind of anticlimactic after that accomplishment. But my father and I kept watching and tracking the program. April 1970, my father and I had a little company watching the space program. Apollo 13 launched without incident. As a matter of fact, it was the first Apollo launch that was not carried real-time by all three of the major networks. But on April 14, 1970, the eyes of our nation and the world turned skyward again. My father and I had become kind of neighborhood experts on the program, and we were answering a lot of questions from neighbors. It was nice that America was paying attention again. It was horrible the reason why. Just 3 days later, on April 17, 1970, the astronauts from Apollo 13 safely returned home. Even though they were a little worse for wear and tear, they had made historic accomplishments in that process. Apollo 13 had the distinguished honor of being the single craft that came the closest to the surface of the moon without landing. In order to make its way back to Earth, the command module Odyssey and the lunar module Aquarius flew extremely close to the surface of the moon in order to take full advantage of a slingshot effect using the moon's gravitational pull. We and our neighbors watched in horror as the spacecraft came around the dark side of the moon and shot like a bullet towards home. The melees towards spaceflight had been broken and replaced by ginned-up fear and hyperbole. It was this fear and hyperbole that killed our long-flight manned space programs. and it is the major reason mankind 60 years later has not yet again set foot on the moon or any other planet. A dream died for my father and me, and though I didn't know at the time, a distance began to form between us. I know we've come to the end of this episode and just entered 1970. Not what I had planned, but nothing of what I'm doing here is planned out. The recordings, the writing, the whole campaign has come out of deep feelings of desperation and separation. And yes, fear. I'm winging it here, folks. It is all coming from the heart. And for me at least, that keeps it genuine. Next, I'm hoping to have episode number 5. That'll be Friday. This time I'm not going to box myself in by giving it a heading in advance. We, all of us, are just going to go for the ride. Hope to see you here Friday. Thank you for your kind support. And may God bless. Welcome back. And this is episode 5, part 1. The Hannings change and Daniel heads to high school. This was a difficult time for me. There were a lot of unexpected changes to my life and the Hanning family. For the past 15 years, things were pretty predictable in the Hanning family. Each summer, around late June, early August, the Hanning family went on a family vacation. The first time it changed is when Kenny Ray, my eldest brother, had left for Army. But the family marched on, and we kept having very enjoyable family vacations. Yes, I know, that was what we call a teaser. Coming soon, a whole episode devoted to family vacations. That stopped, and I'm not sure what year, but I am pretty sure why. As I've told you, my father ran his own business in the garage. He was pretty good at repairing televisions, and this was back in the day when it cost less to have a television or radio or phonograph repaired than it cost to go buy a new one at Walmart. So my father had a pretty lucrative business repairing televisions. Now, for many years, the majority of that money had gone to the family vacation, as I told you before. Some each year would go to improving and updating Dad's ham radio station in the garage. We had spent several years running phone patches, and that station was, well, for my father and I, a part of the family. So many lives had been changed by our use of that equipment. So many families momentarily reunited over a vast ocean at a time of terrible war. Dad and I received some local recognition of what we had accomplished, and it was a source of pride for my father and me for many years to come. Those were incredible times, which were now fading into memory. This was the summer before my freshman year of high school. There was no family vacation. Actually, soon, there would be no father. It took me a good many years to put this all together in my head. I didn't even figure it out until after he was gone. I always helped my father with repairs and picking up televisions. He never really took me with him when he took them back, though. I just figured it was the whole, this is a private adult matter, you don't need to know how much Dad makes thing. If you're from Texas or the South, you're quite familiar with this phenomenon. One Saturday, at the end of my last year in middle school, or right about then, I helped my father load a television into the back of the family van. I turned back to go in the house when my father said, "Hey, Danny, want to go with me?" My father had a gift for asking rhetorical questions that I have inherited. I turned to my father and almost sarcastically answered back, "Well, there are cartoons on, Dad." He stood there and stared at me. I laughed and said, "Yes, I want to come with you." I hopped into the passenger seat and buckled up. We stopped and got some breakfast on the way at a Jack in the Box drive-thru. Thought that was odd. My dad hardly ever splurged on morning food. I blew it off as I wolfed down the hot food, but something just didn't feel right. We drove quite some time and pulled in front of a very nice condo building in the nicer part of Houston by the medical center. I went to the back of the van to start unloading the television. Dad motioned to me to come to the door. He was already standing there. Odd, but nothing to make my hair stand up on my arms. Now, dear readers, I'm going to tell you a little secret. The secret is, I never told this story to anyone in my family. Never told it to my brother Daryl, or my brother Ken, or my mom. God forbid, my mom. I've never mentioned it, that I remember, to anyone. This is a first, my dear readers, and you're experiencing this as I am, in real time. I walked up to the door. Then it started happening. My eyes flashed to what my father was wearing. He usually wore this one-piece jumper thing he always wore when working. Working on the van, working on televisions, working moving televisions, working at home. We were working. We had loaded the television and now would have to unload the television. Why, then, was my father dressed in a Hawaiian shirt and slacks? I hadn't noticed it. That flashed into my mind just as I approached the front step. That was odd. We usually went to the side entrance or the garage to unload appliances we'd worked on. No, now things were getting tingly. Hair on my arms. Okay. So I took a nice deep breath and stood beside my father. He looked down at me and smiled. Then he took my hand. Creepy. Okay, I'll admit, I would sometimes hold my father's hand till I was like 10, 11, 12 at the oldest. I mean, my father was my best friend. We spent more time together than, oh my, I hadn't, Anywho, my father and I had spent a lot of time together and worked together and cut our hands together, got shocked more times than I can remember, I'm willing to bet, and gained together. We had shared goals, fought adversity, and won together. We were in places I had never been before. He held my hand. Honestly, I had a tendency to wander. But we didn't get into that, at least not right now. But standing in front of the door of a customer? No frigging way. That has to stop. Now the hairs on my arm were doing a jig, and I thought my heart was going to leap from my chest. I looked up, took a breath, and gave my father my best but subtle, "What the fuck?" look. He just smiled. The door opened. And here we get into really strong sense memory. Hang on, I've got to get something to drink. This might take a while. Oh, this is cute. Sounds of refrigerator opening, ice rattling, soda being poured, edited. Sounds of a toilet being flushed. Sounds of someone bumping into something, expletives deleted. Sounds of someone almost following into a leather chair. Deep sigh. Okay, I'm back. We can continue. We were standing there at the front, and the front door opens, and I am blasted with the smells of cinnamon rolls, pork, and I can't stress that enough, and the smells of a new puppy. The older woman greets us with that dang, over-the-top, twangy, does anyone naturally speak that way? I mean, from birth? Hello, darlings, come on in! Yeah, why bother saying the whole words? My father drops my hand, about time it was getting sweaty, and gives this woman a squinch. Why was my father giving a customer a squinch? That was a family thing. I shake my head, walk into the room, and begin looking for a dog. A puppy. Danny, I want you to meet Tammy. Tammy, the older woman, extends her hand to me, and I thoughtlessly reach out and shake her hand back. Nice to meet you, Daniel. And she turns and begins talking to my father. My father moves towards her, and they walk back into the house. As I'm getting acclimated to the darker light in the room, I hear the puppy. Well, its tags and collar, and some growling as if some canine, is not very happy. I turn to my right, and into the room comes like this 5 or 6-year-old girl. She is poorly carrying a beagle puppy. Yeah, there is a story there. There's a lot of stories. The beagle, a beautifully brown, black, white mix with classic markings, is being held poorly around its neck. By now, I'm realizing, by a loud child. "Ma, this here dog isn't obeying. I want him to play tea party with me." At this moment, the hairs on my arm stopped, and the hair on the nape of my neck begins to dance. This is end of episode 5, The Hannings Change and Daniel Heads to High School, Part 1. Thanks for watching. I'm going to record the other one right now, but you're not going to see it till tomorrow. Remember, I am running a campaign, Daniel's Power Chair Assistance Fund, and I do still need your help to help me get out of the place I'm in and into a safer place that's built for a power chair. I admit I didn't think this through too well. There's actually an article, I didn't think this through, if you want to read that. But thank you very much. Part 2 coming right up.